When you're ready, start talking.
Right. Well, I think the first thing to say is that I was born into a working class family. I was born a Cockney, strictly a Cockney within sound of Bow Bells. And when I was 2.5, we moved out to one of the new suburbs that were being built on the outskirts of London for working class people, not to buy. In those days it was rent. You rented. Indeed, my mother even rented her stove and the saucepans and the kettle. It was, people didn't have capital. So we weren't, I had a younger sister, and I moved there when I was 2.5. And then, of course, when I was 4, the whole of everybody's life was set upside down simply because the war began. And I can, in fact, remember the day that war broke out. We had a French doors at the back into quite a big garden, and immediately outside that was a stone step. And it was a very hot, sunny day. It was in the morning, and I was sitting with a sort of pair of very short little girl's dress and a pair of sort of little matching knickers on this thing, sitting there. And my mother, there was a man speaking on the radio, and my mother came out and was talking across the fence to the lady next door, and they were both crying. And that speech was Chamberlain announcing the beginning of war with Germany over Poland. In fact, I did have another encounter with Chamberlain a little bit earlier, because I didn't see him, I saw his car when he came back from Munich with the piece of paper. Because we lived near Heston Airport, he landed at Heston Airport, and all I can remember seeing was this bonnet of this big car with a flag on the front of it, like the one my mother had just bought me for a penny. That's my sort of background. The war, of course, we lived in London nearly all the way through the war, through the Blitz, with the Anderson shelter in the garden, really damp because they were thrown together, I think, at the last moment. And my father had to dig out a hole in the front garden, and this thing was made of corrugated iron, was dumped in it with a couple of bunks. We didn't go down because it was so damp. We only went down if the sirens actually started. And we stayed there, and we had to take lodgers, RAF lodgers, and then a war worker when the Americans came to Heston Airport flying daylight things with flying fortresses. And I can remember we had a high belfry on our school, and the runway was just the other side of the school field, and we saw quite a few of them come over that fence and crash. They came back in a very bad condition, and they were very brave. They also had lots of lovely chocolate, which we used to pester the sentries. But because it was rationed, remember, we had 4 ounces of sweets a month, 1 quarter for each week.
Yeah.
And I think to this day, I don't eat sweets very often, but when I do, I'll go straight through a box of chocolates in about an hour, and I'm sure this goes back to the war. And then when the first V1 started, the doodlebugs, we were not hit, but there was a direct hit on a house just across from us, and the whole of the front of the house was sort of I'd been standing by the window not 2 minutes beforehand, because I had never actually seen a doodlebug.
Yeah.
I had, at this time I suppose I must have been about 7 or 8. And I wanted to stand at the window and see it, which on the whole was quite safe, because if you heard it stop, it meant by the time it hit the ground, it was well away from you. The ones you didn't were the ones that were somebody heard a quarter of a mile off and came on you. And this is what happened here. And I was standing near the thing, and my father said to me, by that time we had internal shelters, very strong steel things built in the corner with mesh all around them, and you had your bed, just room for a big mattress. And we all went in there. And I said, I want to see it. And my father said, get in here. And like a kid, I was going, no, I want to see the doodlebug. And he just picked me up and he threw me in. And as he got down on his knees to walk into this shelter, the whole window came in where I'd been standing. And the net result was there wasn't room for us to stay there as a family. But my father, who was doing nights, looking after the dynamos at one of the big government offices in central London, he couldn't go in the forces. He wanted to go in the Navy, but he had broken his ankles, so he wasn't accepted. And I've forgotten the train of what I was saying.
The doodlebug? No.
Oh yes, we had to leave. There was just room for him in the house, and the war worker. I think the loo was working, and the kitchen. There was some kitchen, and there was one back room that was handy, and they lived it like that. And we were taken off. I was evacuated. We were all taken down to Paddington Station, and labels were stuck on us and this sort of thing. And I was lucky because my mother, my sister, was only, she would have been about 4 then, and I had a brother who was about 2. So my mother was allowed, we all went, because she had really young children, we all went. So we stayed as a family together. And we, after a bit of sort of allocation here and there, we took over the Women's Institute hut in a village just outside Worcestershire, in the middle of the orchard country. Most beautiful place in the summer. And every cottage had about 1/4 of an acre filled with trees, and we as children were stuck with very definite discipline. You could take anything off the ground, but you mustn't touch the trees because they were all parcelled up and sold. And I went to school there for some time. My brother died while we were there, which was very hard on my mother and father, and on me, because he and I were the two in the family who sort of clicked, if you know what I mean. It always happens within families, I think. And so we stayed there, and then came back again. By which time I developed a broad Worcestershire accent. A real little yokel, Yeah. But it was really interesting. It was my only real introduction to living in the country before I came to Scotland. So I mean, there was all that gap between that.
So you were born within the Bow Bells, and then you were evacuated, and you lost your accent once.
Yeah.
And then you went to grammar school, and
yeah.
you lost your accent again.
Well,
Tell
yes,
us about
because
that.
I was in the very first year of children who went into, I was a Beveridge kid. There was a social services report which was part, I think, of the Labour Party's price for cooperating in a cabinet during the war period. And the Beveridge report brought in the welfare state. And of course, when Attlee got elected immediately after the war, then this was brought in. And I was in the very first group of children who went into a grammar school in England. The only way you could get in was by passing the scholarship. And I passed the scholarship, and I passed it high enough to go into this school. But they, up until then, you see, they had only taken people well-to-do people.
Money.
And there was this crowd of bums coming in who sort of dropped their H's and did dreadful things like that. And basically, under the guise of teaching me to speak, to talk proper, basically, they did it under the guise of teaching me to recite poetry for competition, which I did for the school, and that was it. I got beaten up at home, of course, because all the kids at home said I was as a snob. Yeah, absolutely. So that was it. We had quite, at school we were got at because I wore thick lisle stockings. I didn't have nylons, which were coming in then, because my mother couldn't afford things like that. So you got that at school, and then you went home and you got snob and got beaten up. So you
Could have went.
yeah, you don't really realise it. I don't think any of the family really realised what it would mean to educate you onto that second stage, that you learn to think differently. Working class people in England, I think being working class isn't class like Marxism. It's a culture.
Yeah.
It's a culture, and you can't break out of it. Your voice gives you away immediately, and so all through that school, you were learning different ways of thought, different approaches to things, and it meant that when you went home, you were suddenly thinking in a way that wasn't on all fours with the way your parents thought. It was really harsh, and particularly since I didn't get on too well with my mother, it made it real differences, real difficulties. And but she still left me there until I was 18, which was I was the first child in the whole of our family, and my mother had 6 brothers, who actually took the A levels.
Wow.
I was going to university. I had a place, and because my mother, when we didn't get on, she was inclined to call me a parasite. I was working when I was your age. I wasn't sort of leeching off my parents, and she said it once too often. And effectively, I told her to stuff it, and I didn't take up my university place until I was 66, when I went and did a full-time history course at Aberdeen University. I actually graduated with a master's 2 days before my 70th birthday. Yeah, it was great fun. I think I knew perfectly well I was going to be very much older than the students. I hadn't expected to be older than the dons, and I was.
Well, what we'll do, I think we'll leave it there, and when we get back to the house, we'll maybe ask a bit about your working life.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a bit cold. Hello. So where we left off was how you lost your accent twice and then gained the accent that you currently have. And I guess that propelled you somehow into your working life.
Yes, because we got to the point where I was leaving school.
Yes.
Yes.
And you left home at 18,
Yeah.
fell out with your mum a little bit. And then so how from there did you become a working woman in the 1950s and 60s? Yeah. That's so I'll stand roughly here so you can yeah, and fire away.
Are we ready to go?
Yeah,
Yes.
ready to go.
But of course I left school in 1953 at 18 years of age, and I got a job with ICI. At that time, it was very unusual for women, other than teachers or doctors, and I'd been headed for the teaching profession, to take a job where you had managerial responsibility. You became a secretary, and I went into ICI, and for a year I was one of their trainees, and was taught shorthand and typing. I was very slow at that because I'm not very good with my hands. I take a long time to learn anything with my hands. And at the end of the year, and I worked for ICI, and I worked there, women, well, that was what women did until they got married. And I worked there until 1956, when I decided I wanted to see a little bit more of the world. I'd done French to A level, so I could manage. And I decided that the best way to go abroad, learn something about it, but have some sort of security, was to go into a French family. And I took a job as what was called a garde d'enfant, which I looked after a child. And I went to some people on the outskirts of Paris, in the banlieue de Paris, and I was taught how to cook by a family that was Normand. Cream and butter and plenty of it, and it was a very nice place to be, and it gave me a lifetime love of France. There's no question about that. I have two countries that are my favourites. One is Scotland, which I encountered later in life, and the other is France, and neither, I'm afraid, is my own native-born one. So anyway, I went to ICI. When I came back, I did a series of secretarial jobs, gradually keeping up the sort of level at which I was writing, and I loathed it. You were, at that time, I suppose the best way of describing it is you were a handmaiden. You could be doing your boss's job, which happened to me on several occasions, but you were not considered as a woman to be suitable for managerial positions. All you could do was act as a handmaiden in the office, and when you were lucky enough to get married, you acted as a handmaiden in your home to your husband and your child. You weren't considered to have enough logic to be able to sort of deal with the problems of business. But that went on for some time, and then luckily I got a job working for the ministry in as a clerk to a ratings tribunal where people appealed against their rates. And it was in the most expensive, it was the Westminster and City, which the value of which was something like about, I think it was 11 times the next biggest, most expensive area. And it was lucky that it was a place where there were a lot of charities. So there was quite a lot of legal business. And I took to it like a duck to water. I didn't stay there. And then eventually I ended up as a clerical assistant with the London County Council. A year later that became the Greater London Council as they took in thing. And within a year I'd taken the internal exam and was on to doing managerial work. And I fell on my feet. I became a project manager and progress chaser, dealing with taking a building site to the point where it was an acreage with people on it at a density between 400 to 600 persons per acre, and clearing it to hand over to an architect and a builder. On the one side, I was working with out on building sites, talking to blokes and foremen and dealing with practical problems on the ground, and on the other I was dealing with multi-million-pound projects and all the problems that entailed, because my job was to see that something went on time and under budget, and basically that is almost unheard of in official projects in England. Anyone in Scotland will tell you about the Scottish Parliament. Somebody like me didn't expect it to go through. I knew what was involved. I knew that you were dealing with a system that didn't work. I know more than I ever want to know about why you can't produce a decent project in this country, an official project, on time. But it was a fascinating job, and I had lots of fun because I had to go back to my roots in the East End. I was dealing with people on the floor. You never quite knew what was going to happen from one day to the next. For example, I had a particular site, a squitty little piece of land, very difficult, in all two pieces either side of a road. We were allowed to develop it, but we were told we must keep the road open because it led to one of the few bridges over a canal that runs through East London. So half the district converged on this path to get across the bridge. And we were told we must develop it in two places and keep this open. We had an Irish foreman who thought that was rubbish. And he was right in terms of a development, but that didn't alter our legal position. And on one occasion, I was rung up by the headmaster of one of the local schools and said, "I think you better get down here." He said, "Your foreman has just put a fence across the road, and there's a gang of dockers coming up behind him and throwing them in the canal." He said, "and they're getting closer and closer together." So I rushed down there, and when I got there, they'd actually met. And they were standing in a big group round, they're all shouting. And they were all considerably larger than me. And I thought, what am I going to do? Anyway, I sort of ducked under people's arms and came up in the middle. And my best schoolmastery voice, I said, "What on earth's going on here?" And they all started shuffling their feet, and I got away with it. And at the end of it, I said to the foreman, I came down here and sorted that out. I said, "If you do that again, not only will I let them drop you in the canal," I said, "I'll come down and help them do it." So that was it. As I say, you just never knew. On another occasion, we had squatters who marched into a building. I was sent for. We'd cleared it. We'd promised the people that we would move them out, do the alterations, and move them back. And we'd moved the first lot out. We were all ready to go, and the squatters decided this was the place to move in and make their political point. And I was called out of a meeting, met the chairman of the local tenants association, and told him what had happened. Went back to the office. The next morning I walked into work, and I had a phone call from the local superintendent of police. What had happened? They decided that they didn't like the squatters interfering with their agreement with us, and they had gone in the next evening, and they'd just thrown them all out through the windows and the doors. That was it. We had our cleared site back again. So as I say, you never knew what was going to happen.
Now, did you once tell me that you went into a site, and when you came in there, it was like a Dickensian Victorian sweatshop?
Yes. One of the surveyors rang me to say that he'd been into a house in Bow, and it had been an office, and what he had found was a totally entire Victorian It was exactly like Dickens and Scrooge, with the the pulpit for the chap the chief clerk, who sort of surveyed all the hoi polloi, who sat on these benches. We even found in a cupboard the big clay bottles in which they mixed the ink, because ink was mixed with powder and water. We found everything, and in fact we turned it over to the London Museum. On another occasion,
at the Barbican.
Yes,
yeah.
And they came down, and I think they moved the whole thing entire into the museum. I'm not sure, but I mean we also on another occasion came across one of the Hanseatic boats that had been sunk at Southwark by the Wat Tyler peasants.
Wow.
On another occasion, it was a Viking boat which we found in the marshes at Woolwich.
Well, I went scrummaging at Southwark once, and I found lots of bits of old pottery, what I think might have been an arrowhead, and I found what I thought was a dog's bone, and I'm pretty sure it was actually a small child's bone, many years later. Yeah. Anyway, you carry on.
You just never knew. London's so many layers.
Yeah.
And you just kept finding these I mean, the most difficult thing was if you came across a plague pit, which happened to me on one occasion. And there is a very strict list of things you have to do. I mean, if the surveyors get half a chance, they will tell the builder to just dig their pit somewhere else and shut up about it. But if you do find one and there's no hiding it, you have to cover everything up. You have to send for the public health people to make sure that it's safe,
sanitary,
from a public health point of view, and you have to get in touch with a company that rejoices in the name of the London Necropolis Company, who have to take all the bones up and rebury them, and you have to find parsons of various denominations to say poems over them. I mean, when I tell you this, you can see why the surveyors say dig a hole somewhere else.
Yeah, well, I dare say they should get a Catholic burial, being the plague.
Oh yes, it's really quite complicated.
Yeah,
but of course the thing was that I left to come to Scotland.
And let's move on to that. So
yes,
when did you leave England? And what was the reasoning, and how did you come to be living in the countryside in Scotland?
Well, the thing is, of course, I married a Scot. And really quite early in our marriage, it was very clear that life for young people without capital to try and buy a house in London was very difficult. And in fact, in the first year of our marriage...
When you say young people without capital, you're talking about yourself and Jim.
Yeah. I mean, in the first year of our marriage, in 1956, we ran into real trouble. We had no money. We were as green as grass, and we thought it would be a good idea to have a child soon, which we proceeded to arrange. And unfortunately for us, what we didn't know was that the wartime controls on rent in London were due to be lifted the following year. As a result, because there was an appointed day in July of the following year, every single controlled rent in London, landlords wouldn't re-let. They wanted to wait until they could charge a modern rent. And the result was that if you, as we were, about to have a child, there was nothing to let at all, any reasonable price. And in the event, we had to take a rent which we couldn't afford, because I was only out of work for 3.5 months the whole time. And we had to take a rent we couldn't afford, and it meant we starved. From Wednesday onwards, I had nothing to eat except my pint of free maternity milk until the Friday evening, when Jimmy, who was studying at school, came home on his bike with some fish and chips after night school. And that was it. You just went hungry. And we were lucky. We were very lucky because we both knew that given time, we'd go up. We were both educated. We knew we could get better jobs. Jimmy was studying. He knew if he got a job, he would get promotion. If he got his exams, he would get promotion. What it must have been like for somebody who didn't have that knowledge behind them to face the fact that they might have to live like that for their whole lives is something that still gives me nightmares and has probably affected my attitude to politics for the rest of my life. I hate to think I would ever get to the point where I would be indifferent to that kind of situation. But anyway, during the course of this, we considered, therefore, emigrating. And Jimmy, being by then a qualified telephone and radio engineer, could have got assisted passage to Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And we decided that's what we were going to do. We applied to Australia because we had some relatives there. And Jimmy said, I'd like to take you to Scotland and show you the places where I lived and was born before we go. And he brought me up. I took one look and I said, I'm not going to Australia. I want to come here. And to this day, I don't know why. I've been asked many times by journalists when I was doing my political work why it was. And I can't say. All I can say is I just felt at home. And it took us 18 years to make it. I went up and up with my job. So did Jimmy. And we ended up in 1975. What happened was the oil. And Jimmy applied for the job as the engineer who ran the two radio stations, the two microwave radio stations that linked the oil rig with the world's communication system. It's a fascinating thing. You could go into that station, he took me on one occasion, and you could throw a switch and you could hear the computers talking to one another. It was really quite incredible. So we were lucky. Jimmy was able to go back to Scotland, where people like he, who were born in the Highlands, if you wanted a job, you went somewhere else. And we were able to go back on the back of the oil. I felt that I didn't want to live in a village. I loathe gossip. And I tend to be rather short with people who want to involve me in gossip. And I knew that with an English accent in Scotland, you have to watch yourself. You can't afford to be toffee-nosed with people. And so we decided that we would live out in the country. And we found a small croft with about 1.5 acres of land. And we moved in there and I started to acquire animals. We also bought various tracts of land till we ended up with just about 20 acres of land. And then my husband lost his job. He got involved in a very unpleasant whistleblowing episode. And as I'm afraid normally happens with whistleblowers, they got rid of him rather than the people who were it would have been difficult to conceal the fact that they suddenly sacked almost their entire team. So it was even easier to set Jimmy up and sack him. And he lost his job. And we decided that we would use the produce from the croft. And we set up a small business with a butchery. And we took pigs from the point where they were a breeding sow and boar, right through to the point where I was selling pork pies in the market in Aberdeen. doing the whole thing for ourselves. It was rather unfortunate. If we'd done it 10 years later, we would have been able to attract a government grant to enable us to have a proper caravan that was suitable for actually butchering on the spot, so that you didn't have to get up in the middle of the night and pack everything beforehand. And it worked reasonably well. But Jimmy suffered a bit from the fact that he never really recovered from the fact that he'd been thrown out of a job for doing the right thing. A job he'd been in for over 30 years, and when he'd done a series, successfully completed a series of quite prestigious jobs. He set up the London television system, which was for the schools. He was involved in setting up the new stock exchange, all the communications, took over the job when it was 18 months ahead and landed it 3 months ahead of it was 18 months behind, and he ended up by taking it through to the point that it was completed 3 months ahead of schedule. And he did he did all the communications for Downing Street, in the course of which he managed to break up a ceiling in the cupboard so that it shattered. The ceiling shattered all over the Prime Minister Macmillan's coats and hats.
I don't know if this is still under NDA, but I remember he mentioned something about maybe a CCTV in a secret bunker or something. I don't know.
Well, there weren't secret bunkers, but the Ministry of Defence was very deep.
Yeah.
And you had to have quite serious clearance to do it. The only time that really ever caused the slightest difficulty, I mean, down there, obviously, I don't know the details of it. Jimmy, we never discussed it. But basically what they had was an operational setup. And the only time it caused any difficulty for us was when my father was dying, and he was living in Dorset, and he kept being at death's door and then recovering, and we were roaring up and down that room and just up that road. And before he finally died, Jimmy was, to get hold of Jimmy, he was under the Ministry of Defence, working deep in the sort of things, and I had to go to the switchboard and say to them, look, my father's dying and my husband's somewhere in the bowels of the Ministry of Defence. Can you find him and let him know? And they were very good. And afterwards we sent them a big box of chocolates because they tracked him down and sent him out and all the rest of it. So it was, it was quite good. So then we came to Scotland. And as I say, we lived on the croft until
18
last
months
year,
ago, yeah.
3 years ago, when we had looked at the possibility. We were getting older, and we were looking at the possibility of whether we could continue to stay there. Well, at that stage, we were both extremely fit, and we felt that we could manage to stay there for some considerable time, provided we did certain works first. And we did that. We decided that we probably, at the state of fitness we were in, we could manage. And we had to do certain works. In the course of doing those certain works, he became very depressed and stopped assisting me. And I had to lift heavy things, dislocated a vertebra in my neck. They couldn't find it, they didn't know at the time what it was, they just knew. We eliminated a stroke, and then I fell. As a result of the sort of partial problems I was having, I tripped and fell, hit my head hard, dislocated the vertebrae to the point that they were squeezing the spine, and was bedridden and had to face the fact that if the operation they were proposing wasn't successful at holding it there, they never promised any more, I would face gradual paralysis. And I was lucky. The doctors not only did it, they improved it, and since then I've been on my own feet. Of course, the thing I haven't mentioned about Scotland that I was doing in the whole of this is the fact that I got involved in the independence movement.
Let's talk about that. So let's just focus on your involvement in the independence movement, and maybe because there's a lot of depth and there's a lot of stories and there's scandals and everything. How did you get involved, and when, and how's that gone for you?
I got involved in the independence movement. In 1979 in Scotland, there was a bill put forward by for Home Rule in Scotland by the then Labour government in 1979. I voted against it at that stage because it was such a dog's breakfast. I thought it would make so much trouble that it just wasn't going to be workable. But over the period between over 15 years, I had to face the fact that the things I valued about Scotland, their culture, their community spirit, their warmth and friendliness, I didn't think were going to survive unless they could follow their own bent rather than being continually forced into English ways of doing things because they were a population of 5 million as opposed to a population of 55 million. And therefore, in 1987, I went to a Burns night supper. And one of the guests at that supper was a man called Alan McCartney. He was a professor of constitutional history, and he ended up finally as a European MP for the Scottish Nationalist Party. And we got on, and you know how sometimes you meet people and you just click. And we did. And in the end, he turned around to me and he said, "Look, why don't you join us?" And I said to him, "But I'm English." And he looked at me as if I'd sort of said something really stupid and said, "What's that got to do with it?" So anyway, the following year, Margaret Thatcher had altered the system in England, and she decided to apply the English system to Scottish schools. And nobody in Scotland approved of it. Her own MPs, including a minister, wouldn't even sit on the Scottish MPs wouldn't sit on the parliamentary committees to bring it through. And I thought to myself that she had to pad the committee with what I call home counties lobby fodder. And I thought to myself, you can't do that. It won't work. Sooner or later, that kind of suppression is going to cause trouble. And I joined the SNP.
So at that point in time...
So that was in 1988.
Margaret Thatcher was incredibly unpopular with the working class in England and Wales as well.
And in Scotland.
No.
Really?
What I'm saying is, at that point in 1988 and through the 80s, when you changed your attitude based on the sort of things that happened, did you notice that other Scots people were also flipping, or was it more of a
bear in
gradual
mind
thing?
that Scots people, that the Scots have always been very much more socialistic. I mean, obviously the Tory party was a rather different thing. They were getting their... Scotland has never voted Tory. Never. It's always been thing. And Tories in Scotland want to keep the Union because it's the only way they can impose their policies on the population as a whole, using the English predilection for voting Tory. But this was the fact that it was her own Tory party people who were against it. But she got it through. Anyway, I joined the SNP, and I was very lucky because I joined it and became a member of the constituency, of which the MP was Alex Salmon. And Alec is this kind of man. He has dedicated his life to getting Scotland independence. And if he sees anybody around the place who he thinks has a gift for doing something, he'll work you to death if he can get away with it. And he asked me, first of all, he gave me local jobs to do. I was the constituency person in charge of branches and membership, and I learned a lot. I had to go around the branches and talk to people and all the rest of it. And you learn all the time if you're prepared to listen. And then he asked me to get involved in an organisation called New Scots for Independence. He was trying to build up a sort of feeling of various groups of people in Scotland who were all coming together to force towards independence. And he set us a task. At that time, the convener, that's to say the chair, was a Frenchman called Christian Albuisson, and I was the deputy chair. Christian left a year and a half later, and I took over. The task that was given to us was to draw together people who supported the independence movement from outside, but who were born outside Scotland, in order to draw a distinction in the minds of the population at whole between racism and nationalism. And we succeeded in doing that. I finally got to the point where a journalist interviewing me said, but there isn't any. You're saying there isn't any racism. And I said, no, there isn't. Look at me. I've been voted into office.
Well, I think the word nationalism means the word nationalism has two different meanings for the colonised and the coloniser. Right?
Yes, absolutely. But anyway, the thing was, that was that. And then he asked me to do something else. And quite honestly, when he asked me, I was so pleased. I didn't dare tell it. I didn't tell anyone until I actually got the letter on my desk. I never told anyone that I'd been asked to do it because I was so frightened he would change his mind. And the job was to be a member of a commission he was setting up. This was we were in opposition and with no chance of government. He was to set up, and our job was to examine the law of land in Scotland, and to advise on how we felt it could best be changed in order to make it of the best use for the people of Scotland. That was our thing. We were told to do it like a parliamentary committee. We sent out letters, and we got something like about 600-700 replies. Some of them really quite extraordinary, including somebody who came back to us claiming to be the real King of Scotland with his coat of arms drawn on the corner of an ordinary piece of notepaper in biro. But we felt that the legitimate letters were all special pleading, and that what we felt we ought to do is to go out into the countryside and talk to ordinary people and see what they felt. And we set up a series of subjects we wanted to cover, like one of them was the good life. People who came up here, like ourselves, and bought a small croft. People, we considered the oil. We considered a steelworks in Motherwell that had been just closed in favour of somewhere in Shetland. We went to Lewis and Harris because half of Harris was administered under half of the island was administered under a trust, and the other half was under the ordinary estate system, and we felt this was some. So we picked places, and then we went and we had public meetings. We asked experts to come and give us evidence, and I threw it open to the public to question those experts themselves if the expert didn't mind.
And that just in that little examples that you gave of places that you went in Scotland is a extreme amount of cultural diversity if you're going from Motherwell to Harris, you know.
Yeah, well, it was Scotland we were talking about.
Exactly, you know.
And it was an education for me. I mean, the thing that struck me first of all, I couldn't believe what the actual land system was, which was of layered proprietorship. There was still superior landlords, and even if you owned your own house, the superior landlord who had owned it still retained certain privileges. He could stop you, he could stop a commercial exercise, he could enterprise, he could tax you effectively. On one occasion, for example, we were given an example of a landlord of an estate, big estate on the west coast, where the wife of one of the gamies was letting teas for tourists. She was giving them jam scones and a pot of tea and all the rest of it. And the estate was taking £1 out of every pound that she made out of her teas. They were taking a shilling. So, I mean, that was the setup. I couldn't believe it when I first heard it, but that was what we were dealing to sort. And at the end, we produced a report. I actually acted as recorder, and I wrote the report. And it caused a lot of interest. I was asked by the Labour Minister, who was also looking at land reform, to sit on an expert committee, which I did. And it was a very interesting time. I had to talk. I went and had to give a talk to the Royal, what do they call themselves, the surveyors of Scotland. What I didn't know was that it was the landowners section, and I was going there and talking to the very people who we were wanting to throw out.
Now, I think on this card, I've got a limited amount of time left.
So what do you want?
Is there anything from birth to now, or any little anecdote or story that springs to mind that you just want to...
Not really.
Not really.
I mean, I feel I haven't got there yet. There's still things to do. And I don't think there's really anything.
How old are you now?
I'm 90. I should be 90 next birthday.
Next birthday. And you're, to some extent, still working at 89 currently.
I'm still doing some
work.
Light political work. I mean, for the last, prior to COVID, I think the thing that I feel best about is that I have gone round Scotland talking to people about independence on a stall at the major agricultural shows, and that in doing that I took a completely different line. I found that people were terribly ignorant about how the governmental system works. They just didn't know. They'd never been taught. There's no way of teaching it, as I can see, properly in school, because everyone's petrified at the idea of school children being got at by party political views, as a result of which civic education is very, very poor. And during the course of the referendum, this became very clear that people were desperate for information, and all they were getting was propaganda. And I changed all my material, and from then on, for the next 15 years, I worked it on the basis that I went on the stall, I talked to people, but more on the basis of getting them to tell me. And then I took that away at the end of each year, sorted out the questions that people wanted to know, researched them during the winter, produced leaflets for the following year. So all the time, what I was trying to do was not to tell them what they wanted, but to let them tell me, and then to provide information, not propaganda. And I went back to sources. Dealing with the common market, I went back to the treaty. Dealing with the oil, I went back to what Norway was doing. So that was it. And I think if I'm thinking about anything I've done in my life, I think that I'm proudest of that I did take it out, that we broke all the rules, we gave people leaflets with no photographs in them, and all the rest of it. And they took them away and you could see them reading them. And I know they read them because they came back to ask questions the following year. And I think that's the thing that I feel I'd like to, and I hope that I shall be fit enough to do it again in the run-up to the 2026 Scottish elections. I hope I will be able to do it.
Well, I think the thing that inspires me the most about you, with everything you've been through, you've hurt yourself, and you are, you've done all these things, you've led several different lives, and you're still sitting on your chair right now with your cane, hoping.
Yeah.
And you still have aspirations at your age. I think that's
I'm
fantastic.
not dead yet.
Exactly.